Welcome everyone to a video review of the game Victory in Europe. Now you may wonder why a review of a game that's been out since 2015, as you can see. Well, the reason I thought I might do that is that there have been several rules updates since, and the latest version is version of the rules 1.3, of which I have a printed copy here. It's free for download on the Columbia Games website. And with this new set of rules, I believe the game is completely changed for the better. That is, I'm pretty sure, in fact, I've always believed that there was a very good game underneath, well, I have to say, the quite messy and vague rules initially. But I've always believed in it, and I believe this latest rule version clears up most of them. Not all of them, but definitely most of them, and the game is certainly playable. Now, I'll just explain a couple of concepts to you, and I'll tell you my thoughts about this game. Now, one thing is, which is quite characteristic for Columbia Games, as far as I know, that they differentiate between area terrain or hex terrain, in this case area terrain, for instance here, which is woods. You have mountain terrain, for instance here in Norway, but you also have border terrain. For instance here you have a wooded border, but in fact both of the areas are clear. Now what does that do? It means that only one army unit can cross such a border in an attack. That's very important to remember. Not if both areas were friendly, then there wouldn't be such a limit. But if moving into an attack, there would be a border limit of one for each army unit. And it's important to remember that, for instance, leaders don't count against border limits, and neither do air units. Obviously, they just fly over the terrain. So you can put in more units, and another way to bypass it is, let's say that this area here were empty. You could have one unit enter across the border and another one like this, assuming that it actually has two movement points. Not all infantry units are equal. Some definitely fight better than others, but some of them also have two movement points where others have one, and in winter all units have just one movement point. So in winter such a move would not be possible because it would require two movement points. Well, anyway, that's an important concept in this game, and I believe by now it's been pretty well explained. Whether it actually makes sense to have border terrain on the scale of this game, that I don't know. I'll leave that up for others to judge who are more knowledgeable about the subject. Some people argue that at the scale of this game it wouldn't really make much of a difference. Well, all I know is that game-wise it works just fine once you figure out how it works, and so I don't really have any complaints about it. I have to say that initially, when the game first came out, this was one of the criticisms that the game received, that the terrain was supposed to be too restrictive. But usually there's definitely a way around it. For instance, if you take this area here, which is the Carpathians, normally if the Germans want to attack it from Poland, well, you could only move in two units. This is clear terrain, so you could move in two, whereas the stacking limit is 3 army units. But you could, of course, also move one from here, or even from Romania, or from this area in Romania, or that area in Romania. So, and that actually happens more often than you think. So, in fact, I believe the border limits are not usually as restrictive as some claim. Now, what else can I show you? Well, initially, I mean, partially because of the rules being rather vague, I'm sure that had to do with it. Many people had many questions, including yours truly, about gameplay. And later on, Columbia Games released a couple of introductory scenarios. For instance, this one, which is freely downloadable from the Columbia website. It's a scenario covering Barbarossa. It's in fact called Barbarossa, so please look it up, download it, and play it if you're learning the game. In fact, if they ever release a second edition, as they recently have for Victory in Europe's sister game, Pacific Victory, I strongly suggest they put in this scenario too, as well as another one, which is on France 1940, I believe it's called. Those two are great introductory scenarios. This one, the Barbarossa one, lets you get acquainted with land combat, movement, even winter weather in the final turn. And it's just a great learning scenario. And the battle in France adds naval warfare and amphibious invasions to it, because you will probably have to invade Norway and or England. And then you can try your hands at one of the bigger scenarios, the big game starting in, covering the entire war, starting in 1939, or there are also scenarios starting in 41, 42, 43, and 44. Now, how does the game work? You actually have a couple of cards. I have two examples here. I actually picked these. These are both Axis cards, by the way. But I picked these two because I actually wanted to show you something else. That some of those cards are still, still raise questions, but just some of them. I believe that most of them are clear by now. Again, the latest rule version covers up most of those unclarities. But these two, for instance, a bridge too far, -2 steps total from British units next to a German area. It's not really clear to me, for example, if that means, British units, could those also be British sea units next to a German coastal area? Does German area mean original German area or simply a German-controlled area? And the same is true for the other card, for instance. Buzz bombs, the V1, 2 units in Britain each lose 1 step. Well, I suppose that also includes naval units and or air units. It must be that, but yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that one is still relatively easy to understand. I guess it could be any unit. But they have to be inside Britain. Anyway, what I was going to tell you, normally each side picks a card, and those cards actually drive play in several ways. The number shows you how many battles and or strategic moves a side can make during its turn. Each year usually has 4 turns if you play the whole year. Some scenarios start in the spring and have only 3 cards. Some start in the summer and have only 2 cards. But normally speaking, if you play the entire war, most years except for 39, which only has 2 cards, all the other years have 4. 1945 might also have fewer if the war ends sooner than it did. You might not even get to 1945. So this regulates the number of battles that you can start or the number of strategic moves you can make. Strategic moves only apply to army units. That is, army units have to pay for them using these points, command points, I believe they're called. But air units and naval units can move strategically for free. It's called rebasing. So some people have complained about this system, that they can't make all the attacks that they would like to attack, that they would like to make. But I actually believe it's a great system in the war itself as well. For instance, in the Normandy invasion, it's not like they landed in Norway and in Denmark and in many other places at the same time. It's a huge operation, and you just can't launch major attacks indefinitely and without any limitations. So I actually believe the system works very well, and apart from that, it also keeps gameplay time-wise limited, which I believe is a good thing. For instance, if you compare it to Axis and Allies, which is one of the games I guess you could compare it to, here the number of battles is restricted by the number of points you have on your command card, and moreover, each battle normally only lasts for 2 rounds. You also have leaders. For instance, I've set up a potential battle here, and leaders can expend 1 of their points and extend the battle by a round, and that way they could last longer, and they also have the possibility to blitz. so that way battles could last longer. But I believe it's a great system. Now, what else can I show you? Well, for instance, I've set up the battle here, and as you can see, to me it was a new concept. Apparently, it's something Columbia Games does very often. Games that I own that were produced by Columbia Games are Combat Infantry, obviously Victory in Europe, Pacific Victory, Pacific Victory uses the same system, and I also have the Eurofront games, East Front, West Front. That one doesn't have this system, and apparently Hammer of the Scots, if I'm not mistaken, I've never played that game, but those games apparently have this system too. But to me it was new and I love it. It's just great. It's not like in many other games that attacks are just simultaneous or supposed to be happening simultaneously. It's not like in many other games that the defender fires first and then the attacker fires. Here, it depends on the category you have. I'll show you a block. I hope you can see it. Well, this one says A2. What does that mean? It means that, well, it just follows the alphabet. So you have A, B, C, and D class units. And obviously, A fires before B, B before C, etc. The 2 means that it hits on a 2 or less. And the big numbers, the 3, 2, and 1, tell you the number of dice that you're entitled to rolling. Now, so as you can see, this German attacking unit would, in fact, roll before the Soviet fighter, which is a B-class unit. And so on, the German tank, and then the Soviet infantry, and then the German infantry. Some of those have higher numbers. For instance, this infantry unit is a D2, that one is a D3. So that is something, as I said, all infantry units and all tank units are not equal, so you have to pay close attention to that. And this is also a great system. You can reinforce battles. If player 1 initiates the battle, then player 2, and that has to do with those cards too. If the numbers here are equal, then the axis goes first, and otherwise the higher number goes first. Now, so that is something great, that on round 2, you can have reinforcements entering the fray, and sometimes that can really tilt the battle. So a great touch, a really nice and effective combat system, if you ask me. Now, something else you can do, which also costs a command, is to conduct a strategic bombing raid. For instance, this is a bomber, it has 4 movement points, and it could move, for instance, to Kharkov and attack the factory here. By the way, all these units are face up. Normally speaking, they would be hidden from view from your opponent, obviously, but I just put them like this so you can see them more easily. Now, how does such an attack work? Officially, any unit in an area could respond to such a bombing raid, officially. Many people have house ruled this, and so have I, because I don't think it's, if you're attacking a factory, that an army unit would really be shooting at you. And even if they would, I mean, of course, there could be certain defenses built in the area, but that's actually already reflected in the factories themselves. They show A1, meaning that they fire as usually the first unit. Yeah, they would always be defending, and it's an A-class unit, so it would always be the first unit firing, and the number of dice they roll is dependent on the number of factory points. For instance, if the Germans attack the factory in Moscow, the Russians would roll 4 defense dice, still at A1. One strange thing about that is that it makes the, well, I'm not even sure if it's so strange, but game-wise, it's safer to attack smaller industrial areas because the chances of actually being blown out of the sky are much smaller, because the defender would roll fewer defense dice against your aircraft. Well, so this German bomber, first as I said, it's not even that strange, because obviously the more important a industrial area, the more heavily defended it would probably be. So the house rule that I use, and as do many others, is that only, well, obviously the factories can defend, but not army units in the same area unless they're attacked. But here the factory is being attacked. And and apart from the factories themselves, only defending air units, and that includes aircraft carriers. Of course, they could not be located in this area here, but if it happened in a coastal area, for instance, there, then it would be possible for an aircraft carrier to defend as well. That makes strategic bombing much more viable because you can actually manage to do some damage. Yeah, so that's a great addition too. Here, the German bomber would roll 3 dice, hitting on a 1. The Americans and British later on during the war have better bombers. I believe they attack at B2 or B2, and at a strength of 4. So so they are more dangerous than the German bombers, but even that makes historical sense because the Germans did not really have any heavy bombers. They only had medium bombers throughout the war. Blitzing is something else that is really nice about the combat system. For instance, if the Germans attacked here, the Romanians could attack here, the leader could cross the border, an aircraft unit, and this one could enter from Kiev. Let's assume that the Germans won this battle and the Russian units here were eliminated. One or more of them could then move on to attack. They earn a full new movement allowance, and a leader doesn't cost anything, so they could cross the river here. But the same is true for the aircraft, but now only one land unit could cross the border because this one is Russian held, so they couldn't go there. So this way, if they wanted to attack this one, they could move on and attack this area here that's called blitzing, and you would reduce the leader by 1 step, and you could initiate 1 new battle per leader. Something else you can do after you win a battle is, for instance, this one, you don't have to leave it in place. If they won this battle, you could also say, okay, I'm going to regroup it, which is putting it into a friendly or a vacant. So it could be an enemy area, but a vacant one. You could regroup it into an adjacent one here. Also, border limits would apply. You can also see some convoy zones here, which provide, in this case, A and B Lend-Lease to the Russians and British, respectively, and these 2 convoys provide resources to France and Britain, respectively. Once France is out of the war, this convoy disappears, by the way. It's eliminated. Also a nice way to symbolize and to represent the war for the Atlantic. Something I wanted to show you here. As you can see, the map is very crowded. This is the original map, and all these units are supposed to be, normally, of course, they would be standing up, upright, and not like this, but even then, areas tend to get very, very crowded. I've had the map enlarged, as have many others, and that makes the game much more playable in the sense that you could actually see where your units are, and you can make out the border terrain much better, which can be pretty essential. Anyway, what I wanted to show you is how an amphibious invasion works. You would have to have a naval unit. In this case, it's a U-boat. Don't be too discouraged by that. It could be any naval unit, and the fact that U-boats are represented on the icon does not necessarily mean, according to the designer, that it only consists of U-boats. There could also be other types of units included, smaller boats and ships and what have you. So a U-boat is enough to launch an invasion with. So, but you would have to have it in place. It needs to be uncontested at the beginning of your turn, and this one would have to be there from the previous turn already, and then you can move 1 army unit, 1 leader, 1 infantry unit, I should say, not a tank unit, 1 aircraft, and also a naval unit, which could shore bombard, for instance, and then you would conduct the naval battle. In such a naval battle, before ground units land, they are treated as naval targets. So, for instance, if we look at the British defenders here. This is an A-class unit, this is a C-class unit. So these two British units would fire at the German ground units as if they were naval units before they actually land. And for the fighter, well, it doesn't really matter. They would fire at army units at a 1. And it says A2, but that's the primary target. That's something else I haven't mentioned yet. But the game distinguishes between primary targets, which is what the number always refers to, and the letter. And secondary targets are usually -1. So this aircraft would fire at other aircraft at A2 and at naval units and army units at A1. So for the aircraft, it wouldn't make any difference really, but the cruiser normally wouldn't be able to fire at army units because they would be secondary targets. It already fires at a 1, and -1 would be 0, so it wouldn't be able to fire at them. But since those army units are considered to be naval units, obviously they're still being transported to the invasion sites, the cruiser would treat them as if they were naval units and would be able to fire 3 dice at them hitting on a 1 before the army units get to fire. So that's more or less how invasions work. In the initial version of the rules, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I just didn't get it. In the end, it turns out to be fairly simple, as is the case for many other rules, that they just look very difficult and very vague and impossible to grasp. But once you actually do, and again, rules version 10.3 is a major improvement over the initial rules, and the game is perfectly playable now. Having said that, the only rule that certainly still needs clarification is Rule 10.3, which is how neutrals are handled in the game. In earlier versions of the rules, neutrals are always shown by means of orange blocks. In previous versions of the game, neutrals, when attacked, would always join the opposing side. That is not necessarily true anymore, and they can revert back to neutral status. Anyway, I think I more or less get it, but I'm not going to try and get into it now because I'm not sure 100% if I get it. So that is still something that would be great if Columbia Games could chime in either on their own website or on Board Game Geek and answer that question, because it has been asked several times, like how exactly does Rule 10.3 and handling neutrals work. Anyway, what is still the same as in previous versions and works just fine is both sides can attempt to have neutrals join their cause, and they do so by rolling 2 dice, and the Russians, the Western Allies, and the Germans all have different numbers for different countries. For instance, for Finland, it's more likely that they would join the Axis, and for a country like Holland or Belgium, it's more likely they will join the Western Allies, for example. And you can have certain modifiers to your die rolls if you have a unit, such as here, adjacent to the neutral country that you're rolling for during the diplomacy phase. Then you get a bonus. You also get a bonus if the other side attempted to have that same country join them on the same turn and they decline. Then you also get a +1 and you get a +2 if the other country attacked them but failed to conquer its capital. And they are all cumulative. So if you have all those bonuses, and you could also have cards such as these with special events on them, and some of them also give you an added bonus when trying diplomacy. So that usually makes it easier. It also keeps the game interesting, because although it is more likely that countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, that they will join the Axis as they did historically, it is possible for them to join the other side. In my latest game, for instance, Hungary joined the Western Allies, and well, that made supplying the German troops more difficult and everything, and they were basically forced to divert their forces to take on Hungary because they couldn't just leave it there. It was literally a thorn in their side, and So uh, every game will be slightly different because certain countries will join different countries than they did historically. Um, so again, that is something I really like about this game. Um, One final thing, rules-wise, that I could tell you is that, for instance, I put an Italian naval unit here, which means that supply from Britain uh, to well, and through the Mediterranean, for instance, to Alexandria, would be blocked, but then they can go around the Cape, which isn't shown, and then basically supply could happen from these red ports here. So I believe it's the 8th Army, I'm not even sure, can't read that very well, could still be supplied. If a unit is ever unsupplied, it uses a step, it loses a step per turn. So that is called supply attrition. But in this case, this unit could be supplied here. But there are some restrictions. I believe you pay an extra point. The point cost in this case would be 2, but in this case, if you wanted to upgrade it, it would cost you 3 to make it go from 3 to 4. Okay, so the conclusions. I love this game. It has become my favorite European theater of operations game. Played a lot of Axis and Allies. I've played Europe Engulfed. I own Triumph and Tragedy, and I can't think of the name right now, but it's also a very well acclaimed war game, but it's a more difficult one, a much more complicated one. I have yet to play it. I haven't yet. Unconditional Surrender, it's called. That's the one. That's the name I was looking for. That one is. I've watched a few videos. I really got into it and I thought, hey, let's buy this game. That's something that happens to me very often. I think most of you can recognize that and can relate to that, but unfortunately it's still unplayed on my shelf, although I certainly want to give it a try. But you can definitely compare this game to Axis and Allies and Europe Engulfed, two games which I have played extensively, and I prefer this one. Unlike Axis and Allies, for instance, this one doesn't go on forever and ever and ever. I used to play for many years at our local flags with several friends, and when we played Axis and Allies, we'd usually only be able to finish a couple of rounds of play, and we'd have to clean up again, and we'd been playing the whole day. Maybe not very efficiently, a lot of talking in between and eating and whatever, but, it was hardly worth setting the game up. This one, especially the shorter scenarios, such as the Barbarossa scenario I showed you here, that one is playable in 1.5 to 2 hours. And that's even if you're learning the game. Yeah, I suppose once you really have the rules down, you could play that entire scenario in an hour, and it's just great. It's a lot of fun. I like the combat system, as I said. I also like the territories and the way that they're actually depicted. You really get the idea that a lot of thought has gone into where exactly to draw the borders, where exactly to have certain restrictions. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is these yellow triangles are called resources. They're resource points, and if you have Axis and Allies, for instance, a country like France would be worth 6 IPCs or something, and here you have only 2 resource points, but it's very important for the Germans to take them, because if you take them in 1940, well, that's several years, meaning 4 turns per year times 4 or 5. Well, just imagine how many resource points those are in the end. So even though the numbers are low, they're still very essential to take, and it also seems historically accurate. Not like, it was great that the Germans took France for them and everything, but all of the production still took place practically in Germany, and that's where the war material was made, and that's also something you can really see in this game. Something that is also historically accurate, for instance, is, if the Allies want to invade Sicily from northern Africa, for instance, they can send along fighters, move 1, 2. Most fighters have a move of 2. They cannot invade from Africa the southern tip of Italy, because that would involve 3 moves. And the same is true, for instance, for Denmark. Why did the Allies historically invade France? They could have also invaded Belgium, perhaps, but because one of the reasons was that they could offer fighter support. 1, 2. If you attack Denmark, you can send along a bomber, because bombers have longer ranges, but they're not as good as fighters. And if the defender actually has some fighters present, it's, well, quite likely your bombers will be shot out of the sky. So it's small things such as those in which I believe the game really manages remarkably well to, well, to replicate history. Well, that's probably not the right word, but it feels historical when you play it. Well, despite the fact that the rules are very light, you still get this World War II feeling, and always in a slightly different way. Well, anyway, as I said, I strongly recommend this game, especially with rules version 10.3, and I just thought this game deserved another review, because you will read many of the posts here, which may seem quite negative in the sense that many people were complaining about the rules. Most of them are fixed now, and underneath it all is just a fantastic game, and I thought it deserved another review, a very positive one, and I think this game deserves another chance. So if you bought it previously and it's sitting on your shelf, please take it out. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Download the latest rule version. If you don't own the game yet, I would say get it. It's a fantastic game, and I love it. Victory in Europe. Give it a try.